You have to be doing a control and proximity guide for EU5, since control is one of the most important mechanics in the game. If you have no control in a location, then you get basically no value out of that location, except for through trade. I'm going to start out by talking about sources of control other than proximity, things like being a core. Then we're going to talk about sources of minus proximity costs that are specific to the location, things like having a bridge. And then we're going to finish off by talking about countrywide modifiers like the centralization societal value. There will be chapters in the description for that. Having land cored is the biggest source of base control, giving plus 20 max control, whereas conquered gives minus 10. This means you pretty much always want to have a large portion of your cabinet on integrating, unless you need to like change societal values. You pretty much always want to have a ton of guys integrating. And if you've got too many provinces to integrate, like I do in this case, then it can make a lot of sense to release subjects in the land so that they can use their own cabinet to integrate them. They actually don't auto-integrate even their capital, and if you annex them before they integrate it, then you don't get cores on it, but that's not really a big factor unless you release a subject and grant them a lot of stuff, because they can integrate a single province pretty easily. I haven't really started integrating subjects into my own gameplay too much yet, but I think it's going to be good to release subjects in Conquered Land if you have too much to integrate with all your current cabinet members at a single time, and you don't have proximity to any of the locations except for through bailiffs. The nice thing about keeping your subjects really small is you can get an insane boost to annexation from them being much smaller, so I would recommend keeping your subjects pretty small. Now, there's two other big things that boost control, being a city or town and having a temple. Building temples is very good because they're super cheap and give 5 max control, but I would not upgrade to cities for the control. The main reason you upgrade to cities is because you need the building cap. It's not because you want the control. The control is just a nice side effect of upgrading to cities. There are some other modifiers like average satisfaction and the cabinet action, but they really aren't that important. So I'm going to move on to location proximity modifiers. It's time to talk about maritime presence. This is the most important way to get proximity in the early game, assuming you have a coast, because you can get proximity cost for every sea node down to only 5. The base cost is 30, but only having to pay 5 is so low that you can spread proximity super far, like all the way down here. We still have 53% proximity. If we were to go if we were to go half the number of locations through land, then we would be at only 25% proximity. So it is so much better to go through naval in the early game. The best way to spread maritime presence is going to be to use ship stacks of roughly 15 to keep your maritime presence up in sea nodes that you already have 100 in, and then have the rest in a huge stack that you move between sea nodes until that sea node has all of its tiles at 100 maritime presence. If you're too lazy to do that and then like split it off every time you hit 100, then what you can do is just tell it to patrol the seas and go between all of the sea nodes that you want. You just gotta click something in them, or you can click like this, and it will patrol that way. But the downside of this is you'll sometimes lose the 100 in areas you've already been to, so it's a little bit less proximity that you'll end up getting, but it's more convenient. But to get that maritime presence, you're going to need a ton of ships. In this case, I have 99 ships. And to get all those ships, you're going to want a lot of sailors. But the only way to get a lot of sailors is to embrace the banking institution. So in the early game, you're going to want to trade as much as you can with people that have the banking institution, so you can import it from them. And you want to get this as fast as possible, and then rush the dock advance, because that is the advance that lets you start creating a lot of sailors. Getting the bark, even though it's a good light ship, actually isn't that important because per sailor, it's actually a very similar amount of maritime presence. You can see traditional galley gives 0.08 maritime presence per, whereas the bark gives 0.14. So relative to the amount of sailors they give, it's actually incredibly similar. But the dock has another use. It gives harbor capacity, along with a couple of other buildings, such as the protected harbor. And harbor capacity influences the cost of leaving a port. You can see if we look at our proximity thing here, you can see it costs us 0.01 to leave Constantinople because it has so much harbor capacity, along with development and a couple of other modifiers. Whereas going into this tile costs 15 because it has a little bit of harbor capacity, but not a ton. And we can check harbor capacity with the harbor capacity map mode. You can see this tile has 75% just from its natural harbor, whereas if we look at a different tile like Constantinople, it's getting a little bit from having a wharf, which is another early game building you can build, and then a dock as well, which gives us 0.1 harbor capacity. Each point of harbor capacity gives 75% reduction, so each 0.1 gives 7.5%. So that's going to be a pretty significant way to reduce your proximity cost. Next up is rivers and the two buildings that come alongside them, bridges and pound lot canals. For a pound lot canal, you can only build it in a city, so this really incentivizes you to build cities on rivers if possible. And then bridges, you can build anywhere. You pretty much just want to build them anytime that a location would be remotely useful to have minus proximity cost. Like this location is an example of a location where it wouldn't really be useful, but for pretty much anywhere else, you'd want to build up a river or you'd want to build up a bridge because it will give you -5 local proximity cost. The other benefit that rivers have is if you're going downstream, it costs -30 proximity, and if you're going upstream, it costs -10, although that's pretty rare to actually have an effect because building even a gravel road will give you -20, and the effects do not stack. They just, whichever one is higher gets picked. So -30 is the equivalent of a modern road, which is very, very good to get for free, since normally you'd have to wait until the age of absolutism for that, which is pretty late into the game. Hungary is an example of a country that really benefits from a lot of their proximity going down this main river here, because it's going downstream. Unfortunately, it's really hard to tell what rivers are going downstream, except for just hovering the proximity cost. I wish they made it a little bit more obvious. There's a river areas map mode, but it seems to just show nothing. Now it's time to talk about roads. Unfortunately, the map mode for roads is essentially useless because it doesn't show which direction the roads are going in. It just shows what the highest tier road that's in a location is. And yeah, that's the thing. Roads aren't, you don't just build a road in a location, you build a road between two locations. It will go back and forth though. Like if you have a road that way, then it will also go this way. But there is a small thing about that, which is you always want to go out from the capital because I think that way it will consider rivers better. Otherwise, it will consider the rivers, assuming that downstream is the opposite downstream. And pretty much to build roads, what you're going to want to do is click anywhere that you think would be best to go from your capital, and the game will just pick the best way to get there by a road. Of course, if there's a place that you can get better proximity to via a naval thing, then you want to build roads from that naval place as well, because that'll be better. Outside of the very early game, it's almost never not worth building roads if it's going to be used at all. Of course, you unlock new road text throughout the game, starting out with unlocking the paved road in the Age of Discovery. Paved road. That gives you -25 instead of -20, which is effectively a 25% better road. And then in the Age of Absolutism, you unlock the modern road, which is effectively 33% better than the paved road, giving -30 proximity cost. These are relative to 40 being the base. And then in the Age of Revolutions, you unlock railroads, which give -35, which is effectively twice as good. So that's a very big jump up. Now for a brief discussion on capital placement, I think you want to put it in the middle of your coast, that is like relative to distance in C nodes. So like in this case, it would be like the center of here, here, and here, like Brest, southern France, and southern Morocco. The most central point to all of those is somewhere in like southern Spain or maybe western Portugal. And this is so that you can spread naval proximity. There are some cases, though, where it can make sense to put an inland capital. Like, if you're playing into the Age of Revolutions, railroads are so good that naval proximity is kind of dead once you get there. So it makes a lot more sense to put your capital more inland, somewhere like Madrid. And also for France, I think Paris makes a lot of sense because it is pretty close to Tancarville. You can get like 80% proximity in Tancarville pretty easily, and it's a good enough natural harbor to spread proximity. Oh yeah, you also want to pick something that's a good enough natural harbor. You want roughly 50% natural harbor suitability or better. That'll be enough to get you up to that -100% that you need pretty early on. But you do need a significant coastline to make it worth it. Like if you're playing Russia, unless you conquer like all of the Baltics, it's not really going to make sense to move your capital to some place like St. Petersburg. It's going to be better keeping it in a place like Moscow that is more central to your control. Also, of course, some topography and vegetations can make proximity cost a lot higher. Proximity impact basically means proximity cost. So 50% proximity cost for mountains is insane, especially if you're stacking -50%. That's effectively doubling the proximity you're going to have to pay, which is very, very large. But an important thing to know is that you only pay that proximity cost when you leave the location, not when you enter the location. So this means that if it's like a singular mountain, it really does not matter. All that really matters if there's a set of hills that block you from going to the other side without crossing them. So like in this case, the hills are blocking us from going to this flatlands. But other than that, they're not actually that much of a problem. I'm gonna just quickly mention bailiffs. They're trash. Don't build them. The AI can build them, and you don't need to destroy them, but they're not really useful. They give a lot of power to the nobles, and they only give a local proximity source of 20. And 20 is basically 0 because the effect of having proximity effectively scales with the square of the amount of proximity you have because it needs to be able to spread to adjacent locations, and it can spread 5 times less far, as well as being a 5 times weaker effect on those locations if you have 20 proximity instead of 100. However, the Iberian countries specifically have a better version that you can only build outside of your home region. And this one is much more viable because it gives 25, or the upgrade it gives 30 proximity source, which makes it a lot better. 30 is effectively twice as good as 20. Now it's time to talk about countrywide proximity modifiers like the centralization societal value. This one is amazing right now. It gives 50% crown power, minus 10% proximity cost. I have heard that soon there's going to be a minus loyalty of subjects on this though. But unless that's like literally minus 50, I think you still always want to go centralization because you can just pay off that with upping the Diplo slider to get your subjects to be loyal again, and it's worth it for minus 10% proximity cost because minus 10% proximity cost is just so good. Here's an example of a set of modifiers that can get you a lot of centralization progress. You want to get to whatever your 0.73 is times 100. So in our case, we would want to get to like 73 centralization or 63 because we're getting 0.1 from Parliament being in the capital. So that's not really reliable. And then once we're there, you can delete all the modifiers that you were just going for centralization progress for. As long as your centralization progress stays positive, it's not going to go backwards, so you'll be fine. And you can get the last little bit by calling parliaments and going the expand gravel road network parliament debate. Now, once you get your centralization to a good value, what you'll want to do is start changing some laws that are very good but give you decentralization progress. For example, itinerant court. This is monarchy exclusive, but most of the time you're playing monarchies, so I'm talking about it first. And also, you'll want to replace feudal administration with confederal union because that gives another minus 5%. So if we were to call Parliament, then we would be able to change the law, because you want to change the law this way, because otherwise you'll get a massive stability drop. And then over the course of the next few years, you get access to that minus 5% proximity cost. Of course, you want to use the Parliament as well for itinerant court. Now, what if you're not a monarchy and so you don't have access to itinerant court? Well, luckily for you, every government type has an equivalent. If we find a theocracy and a republic, let's look at Venice for the republic. There is going to be in here a law that gives minus 5% proximity cost. I think it's this one. Minus 5% proximity cost. Theocracies have a clergy privilege, I think, that gives you minus 10% land proximity cost. No, it's not a nobility privilege, but it does give minus 10% proximity cost. And then the strongest is actually tribes, which have access to minus 12.5%. Sorry, I actually meant hordes, not tribes. And also, I was wrong. It's not a 12.5% reduction. They could get a 7.5% reduction. And that is because they get legal basis giving minus 2.5%. And you can get minus 10% from federal tribe. And you might think, oh, that's 12.5%. You were right. But actually, tribes and steppe hordes are the only ones who do not have access to administrative system, meaning they cannot get the minus 5% from confederal union, dropping them down to minus 7.5%. And tribes don't have legal basis, so they're minus 5%. Now we've got the land versus naval value. The thing is, it's actually incredibly hard to push either side in this, because you can sometimes just accidentally flip back and forth in which one you're pushing. I think it's usually easier to push naval, in my opinion, although I've heard some people saying that they think it's easier to push land. I think land is a better value because it gives minus 10% proximity cost through land, which is very good because if you stack that with all the other proximity cost modifiers, that's effectively like reducing your proximity cost by a third relative to if you had every other modifier but not this one because they apply additive reductions, which is very overpowered way of modifiers stacking. Whereas naval gives minus 1 proximity cost through maritime, which is going to be multiplicative with all the other sources of minus proximity cost through maritime, except for the one from, I think, an Age of Discovery Tech has a proximity cost through maritime. Yeah, coastal expansion gives you minus 0.5. So basically, push land as hard as you can, but it's going to be pretty hard to get it past like 50%. What you can do is do some parliament agendas. Sometimes you can get land values here, although it is kind of rare. The burghers will do naval. If you're really desperate for more land values, you could delete your navy, and that would give you a little bit more towards land values as well. Next up, we have ruler admin skill, which you might think there isn't really that much you can do to influence this, but the basic way you can influence this is just by setting your child's education to administrative, but the real way to do it is swapping over to the elective succession law. And as you can see here, score per administrative ability +1, score per diplomatic ability +1, score per military ability +1. And what this means is you get characters that have really good stats here. Like, this is not a particularly lucky roll. You almost always get a character like this that has 99, 80, 100, or 100, 50, 100, or whatever. You're almost always going to have one of these three characters have a greater than 95 admin skill. So how do you get the succession law? Well, you want to go into here, and you want to look for the rights of the nobility. And this has a specific law that we want to go for, which is nobility electorate. You'll see the exclamation mark, which usually means that it's exclusive to something, but in this case, it's just exclusive to being a monarchy. And this gives you the ability to use the elective succession law or the dynastic elective succession law. Dynastic elective succession isn't as good because I think it only goes from your dynasty or something. I don't know, it usually picks bad characters, whereas elective succession can pick all of your nobles as well, meaning that it pretty much always picks an insanely high skill character, and you don't have to worry about it at all. It'll give you three options, and you just pick whichever one has the highest admin skill, or unless there's one that's really close and has way better stats than the other ones. There is a small downside, though, which is that you cannot have personal unions while you're using this, or else you'll just lose the personal unions whenever your ruler dies. Then we also have the Supreme Court building, which gives -5% proximity cost, as well as some crown power. And the final thing before the biggest source of minus proximity cost is going any Reformation religion lets you get this -5% proximity cost from appointment of bishops. It does not have to be Lutheran. It can be pretty much any Catholicism or any Christianity that isn't Orthodoxy or Catholicism, I believe. Hussitism gets it, Lollardy gets it, Lutheranism gets it, and I'm pretty sure Calvinist also gets it. Now it's time to talk about the techs that just give you straight up minus proximity cost, starting off with local infrastructure, which gives -2.5% in the Age of Renaissance for picking up admin focus. Pretty much always want to go admin focus for this tech, I think. Diplo focus does make a little bit of sense because it gives -5 war score cost, but I do prefer admin focus for this -2.5 proximity cost. Then you have to go pretty far away from that, all the way to the Age of Absolutism to get your next ones, from Measuring the World, and also another one in this age for picking up admin focus, which is centralized government for another -10%. That's a -20% proximity cost in a single age. That's so much. And then if you go to the Age of Revolutions, I can't show it because I'm not in the Age of Revolutions, but if you pick up the Diplo focus, there's a tech called like Postal Road Networks or something that lets you get -2 cost to your roads, which if you're using railroads, that makes it go down from 35 to, or from 5 to 3, which is a huge reduction in the cost you're paying. So it gets a 40% reduction, which is, yeah, pretty huge. So not counting that Postal Road Networks thing, because it's applying a little bit different, and it's not additive modifier, that is a total of -77.5% proximity, not counting your local modifiers. Obviously, you have things like bridges and development, which can let you get more, but that's 77.5% just on your global modifiers that anyone can get. Now I'm going to be talking about what Russia specifically can get to bump that up even more. Russia is the country with the most modifiers. They get -10% proximity cost through land from Sudebnik. They get -10% proximity cost from Voivode. They get -2.5% times your cabinet efficiency proximity cost from this cabinet action that I believe requires the Prikazi government reform, and that can give pretty much up to like 7.5% if you're stacking a lot of really good modifiers. And then finally, if you have to wait till 1700 for this one, but you can get an event to get you the Collegium, which gives another -10% proximity cost. There's also Zordom, but that requires you to be Orthodox, so it's not worth it compared to the -5% you get from being Protestant. So in total, assuming 200% cabinet efficiency, which you can go higher than, that would be 115% proximity cost reduction that Russia can get, or 135% if you're willing to claim the Mandate of Heaven from China. Right before we end off the video, I'm just going to quickly show off how insane the pathway can get to spread proximity if you have enough minus proximity modifiers, because it just does not care about these -0.01s at all. It'll do whatever it can to avoid the minus proximity cost of like these forests. But yeah, that's the end of the video, so goodbye!